Do you know the inspiration behind this cutie? My name's Yandis DC, your aspiring Pokemon Almanac, and I'm here to give you everything I know about Pokemon. So today we're going to be talking a little bit more about Japanese mythology and some Pokemon lore. I recently did a video on Koraidon and Miraidon being past and future dragons, so go check that video out if you haven't seen it already. So obviously talking about Whiscash. Whiscash is a 3rd gen Pokemon. It is a water and ground type, so introduced during the Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald era, if you forgot which gens are which. And it's an interesting one. It's actually a pretty famous story in Japan that has caught it placed in a bunch of different animes. So I'll talk about some of those references that you guys may recognize after I've kind of given you the full story and the background on who Whiscash's sort of namesake is. So Whiscash in Japanese, its name is Namazun with an N at the end. That's important. And the reason that's important is because Japanese for catfish is Namazu, and then the original name of the mythological figure that we're talking about is O Namazu, which simply adds the O at the beginning, making it a giant, so giant Namazu or giant catfish. And in most stories and most literature that has been found revolving around Namazu, it's usually just shortened down to Namazu, because I think it's pretty clear that if you're talking about the catfish that battled a god, it's not like, well, you didn't put the giant in there, so are we talking about the same catfish? You know, obviously it's pretty obvious what you're talking about. So generally just referred to as Namazu, which of course is still the same as just regular catfish in Japan. And the reason that there's an N on Whiscash's Namazun is because really, I think it's because it's just like kind of a cutifying aspect. They tack N on to the ends of names and titles, especially in anime. You'll see it to kind of just, you know, reference this thing is like a cute version of itself. So, and I mean, look at it. It makes perfect sense. This thing's a derpy little adorable dude. So it makes sense that you're going to be like the cute catfish. You know what I mean? And if I'm wrong on that, please feel free to let me know in the comments. That's just the best answer I was able to find. So the story behind Namazu is that the giant catfish lives underground, or, you know, it's kind of vague, but basically it lives underground or deep in the mud. And it's near this famous rock called the Kaname Ishi. And that basically translates to pinning stone. So the idea is that this giant stone holds down the entirety of Japan. That way it doesn't float away, or at least that's like the traditional belief. So the Namazu, or Whiscash, or whatever, lives near this stone, and being that it's massive, is constantly thrashing about, especially when it's in a bad mood, and that's what causes all these earthquakes. So the god that ended up putting a stop to this is referred to as Takemikazuchi, and it's actually a very famous god. It's almost like, I think the best way I can say this is it's almost like Japanese is Thor. It's the god of thunder. It's also what's known as a sword god, so obviously a pretty strong fighter, and the reason he was there at all was because he was sent down by the deities of the heavenly realm to kind of establish rule over the earthly realm. And while doing so, you know, Takemikazuchi made his name by kind of doing a bunch of different stuff that got him all these little stories, and one of them is the story of his battle with Namazu. So what ended up happening is he, to stop the earthquakes, picked up the Kaname Ishi, or the pinning stone, and slammed it down on the catfish's head, pinning it in place, and ultimately keeping it from being able to cause these earthquakes, which is believed to have mitigated a lot of the earthquakes that we could have had. And the reason that you still have earthquakes is because, of course, Takemikazuchi is very busy. So as a busy god, he has to go different places, especially back to the heavenly realm from time to time. And when he's not around, well, Namazu's not behaving, and it's trying to escape that rock. So that kind of escape effort is what causes the earthquakes we have today. And that's actually not a belief that's actually a belief that came around a little bit later as far as Japanese mythology goes. It wasn't really popularized as a theory that the Namazu was creating these natural disasters until the 18th century, so like 1700s, even though it had been a story that had been, you know, told, you know, the creature of Namazu had existed since like the 15th century, 1400s, but it became more associated with these natural disasters later on. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. So when you look into the story behind Namazu, and you start looking up kind of how he went from being just this giant catfish to this giant catfish that causes earthquakes and tsunamis as well, because a lot of earthquakes in Japan, based on how the country is set up, come with tsunamis. And that's another reason that Whiscash is kind of this water ground type, because it is a fish and it lives underground, but it also causes tsunamis and causes earthquakes. So it all kind of goes very seamlessly together. And looking into how that association got made, there isn't a lot of clear, direct linkage. So I didn't find anything that said, well, because of this, this belief came about. And so I did a little bit of research, and what I found very fascinating is the history behind earthquakes in Japan. And that's the part where it started to make a lot of sense why the timing of this belief came about. So to give some reference, talking about earthquakes and things, which is even more relevant to conversation right now with what's been going on in Japan in the last couple of weeks. The history behind the earthquakes is really interesting. So the sort of written record of earthquakes that I was able to find goes back to about 684, in the time before the Tokugawa period. So the Tokugawa era was a shogunate era. That period existed from 1603 to 1868. Prior to that, we only have records going back to 684. So from 684 until about 1603, there was only 7 earthquakes in total that were recorded, or at least that were big enough to care about recording or whatever. So there was only 7. Now, in the Tokugawa period, which went from 1603 to 1868, which is only about a 250-year period, as opposed to the almost 1,000-year period prior, there was 18 earthquakes, which is crazy. 7 earthquakes recorded in about 1,000 years, and then 18 earthquakes recorded in a quarter of the time. And they weren't just little earthquakes. I'll give you guys some perspective on how bad these were by first talking about some earthquakes that we were already very familiar with. So one of them is the 1906 earthquake that happened in San Francisco, and it was devastating. I mean, it was the one that like cracked the floors across San Francisco. It caused a total of estimated 3,000 plus deaths up and down the peninsula, and that was a 7.7 to 7.9 magnitude earthquake. So massive earthquake, right? Lots of people died. Terrible thing. We have the earthquake that just happened on January 1st, and that was a magnitude 7.6, so just under what the 1906 earthquake was. And the 1906 is considered to be one of the worst earthquakes in populated history. So it really says something that kind of bar around 7.5 to 8 is where we see the worst kind of earthquakes occurring. And in January, or on January 1st of this year, we had a magnitude 7.6. Like I said, there was a 17-foot tsunami that was caused by this. And currently, very sadly, there is a death count of 100 and possibly more to come. So 2 very devastating and, very talked about earthquakes, but they're nothing compared to what happened in that 250-year period where all these earthquakes were happening. And the timing of it being 1603 to about 1868 is the time period that all these earthquakes happened. It makes a lot of sense that around the 1700s, 1800s, that was when the association between the Namazu and the natural disasters came about. I guess because the catfish whiskers are used to sense vibrations in water, so that's how they find prey and things, even if they're in really dark, murky waters or dirty waters, because they can live in pretty much any environment. So it was perceived by farmers and fishermen that the catfish would start acting weird before these big earthquakes would hit. So that's where that connection kind of came about in those later years, but also because there were so many devastating earthquakes. So we talked about San Francisco, 7.7. We talked about the January 1st, 7.6. In 1707, there was the Hoei earthquake, which is the last eruption of Mount Fuji. That was an 8.6. 1771, there was the Great Yayayama tsunami, which was 13,500, give or take, reported casualties. 13,500. That's over 10,000 more than what happened in the San Francisco earthquake. And that one also came with a 60-foot tall tsunami. So the one that happened this year, 17-foot, 60-foot tall tsunami with this 7.4 earthquake. Absolutely insane. So the Fuji earthquake, 8.6, the Yeyama earthquake, 7.4, with these giant tsunamis. There's even stones and like boulders that this tsunami launched from the sea into the Japanese mountainside that are still being found till today, that are being, analyzed and realized that those weren't supposed to be there. They were from this event. Then we have the 1792 earthquake, which was the Unzen earthquake and tsunami. That one was a 6.4. So, the smallest of the ones I've mentioned so far. And that one came with 15,500 casualties in total. So over just those two earthquakes, we've got almost 30,000 casualties. Absolutely insane. And then in 1854, 3 earthquakes in the same year. One was a 7.2, one was an 8.4, and then the third one was an 8.4. And that one had 13,000 plus casualties. So it makes a lot of sense that they were looking for some answers, because in their whole written history up until this point, there'd only been 7 earthquakes that were anywhere close to these. And then in 250 years, they have a ton of earthquakes. And in under 100 years, they had most of the most devastating earthquakes that has ever been seen in their country and in most parts of the world, especially in populated places. So absolutely insane. But especially with these stories about the catfish kind of being a natural signal for these things, it makes sense that they started having earthquakes and tsunamis together associated with catfish, associated with the story of Namazu, and with Whiscash. That all makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I appreciate you guys sticking around for the course of this video and this story. There's a little bit more here I'm going to talk about, but if you're not an anime nerd, this part may not be as interesting to you, because there are a lot of references for both Namazu and Takemikazuchi in anime today, which I thought was pretty interesting because I actually remember seeing a lot of these, and you guys may too. So obviously we have Whiscash. That's one reference. And apparently there was actually supposed to be a whole episode about Whiscash back in 2004, but because of the earthquake that Japan experienced in 2004, it wasn't aired, obviously, because it would have been a pretty sensitive subject at the time. We've also got Namazu in places like Legend of Zelda, all the way back in Link to the Past. You actually get the Quake medallion from a catfish. There's Dragon Ball GT. There's a character called Zunama, and he is a giant alien catfish creature dude who can detect earthquakes or seismic activity with his little whiskers. We've got Suzume, that killer movie. If you haven't seen it, you have to go see it, by Makoto Shinkai. One of the best animated movies of all time, and especially one of the better anime movies that I've seen in the last decade. And in that movie, there are these, not to give away too much, there are these worm monster creatures that cause all these earthquakes. And the story of Namazu and the Namazue, which are art and literature pieces about Namazu, primarily from that Tokugawa period, there is a reference to those in the story of Suzume. And then the coolest one for me, because this is actually where I found out about this story of the giant catfish, is River Monsters. I'm sure a lot of you people remember River Monsters. It was an amazing show with Jeremy Wade going all over the world, catching the biggest and baddest freshwater things he could find. And to my understanding, this was actually the only one they never managed to catch. There were some that they failed in the early seasons, and they went back in later seasons and managed to sort of finish up their goals and catch a certain fish or gecko or salamander or whatever the hell it was they were looking for. But the giant catfish was the only one that they weren't able to get ever, which I think is pretty cool. And even more relevant to what's going on today, the catfish has actually become this sort of symbol of natural disasters in Japan, which obviously we talked about a little bit, but I mean literally. When you're in Japan, there are these signs that talk about, earthquakes and tsunamis, and they have this cartoony catfish as the sort of mascot for the signs. They have early warning apps that have catfish as their little mascots for the companies that make these apps and put out these notifications. So the catfish really has become a full-fledged symbol of these things, good and bad, as a sort of warning to help you stay safe, as a sort of omen of something to come. If it's a natural disaster, there's a catfish involved. But it's just really interesting getting to see how Japan incorporates its mythological figures and stories and beliefs into its society in these very subtle but impacting ways. And now for some bonus information, we can talk about Takemikazuchi real quick because I looked and I can't find an excuse to talk about him and other Pokemon. I don't really see a connection to any of the other Pokemon's names or backgrounds that would allow me to do this. So it's going to come at the end of this video since it's already relevant. So Takemikazuchi is the, like I said, that thunder god and that sword god from the heavenly realm, came down to the earthly realm to kind of take over and establish rule for the heavenly deities. And he did a bunch of different stuff that gave him all of his legends in the course of this conquest. Now, one of the most famous and the one that I found the most interesting, of course, outside of the Namazu conversation, is that when he first came down to Earth, he sort of politely asked the existing earthly deities, you know, hey, we're trying to come in and take over. We'll take good care of you and your land. Do you mind just like getting out of the way? And the lead deity was like, you know, I'm older. Let's leave it to my sons. They're gonna be taking over soon anyway. One son was like, are you telling me I get to go fish all day and not worry? Like this place is gonna be fine and I don't have to pay attention? Yeah, I'm totally down for that. The other brother though was not having it. He was like, no. You don't just walk in here and take our stuff. Fight me for it. So Takemikazuchi and Takeminakata, I think I got that right, go to fight each other in this sort of wrestling match. And it stated very quickly and very consistently, but without any other details as to what this really means, it stated that Takeminakata tried to grab Takemikazuchi's arm, and it turned from an arm into an icicle into a blade. And then when Takemikazuchi grabbed Takeminakata's arm, so when Heavenly grabbed Earthly's arm, it crushed like a reed. So it was a pretty clear victory for the heavenly realm on this one. And that also came to be known as the first ever sumo wrestling match, was that sort of grappling between those two deities, which in and of itself is a pretty cool story. But the cherry on the top for that one that I thought was really funny was when you read this and then you go, okay, well, I wonder, you know, what I'll get as my answer when I go and Google first ever sumo wrestling match. So it actually states that the first ever sumo wrestling match happened in, I want to say 23 BC. And it was two gentlemen that were ordered by the Emperor Suinin at the time to wrestle. The two people fighting were Nomi no Sukune and Taima no Kuehaya, and Sukune ended up being the winner. But when you read this, it doesn't just say this was the first sumo wrestling match. It says this is the first sumo wrestling match between mortals, which I thought was really awesome, because even when they officially state something from their history, they're like, well, that was the first one between humans. We already know about the other dudes, the deities that had their first sumo wrestling match. And it's not even like it's like they allude to it like, well, you know, there is the story that the gods did it first, and this is, you know, where it really happened. No, it's just straight up first one between mortals. This is that one, which I thought was awesome. And lastly, there is some really great instances of Takemikazuchi being found in different animes and things, simply because, like I said, he's even more famous than Namazu in this case. And so one of them is in a small anime called Noragami. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty good. It's a short one. It's about how gods gain their power from the belief system of people believing in them. And I think you're following a god who kind of doesn't have any followers anymore, not to give too much away. Overlord. A lot of people have seen Overlord. And in that world, that video game world, there's these all-powerful beings that built this world, being this like game and this army and all these, you know, things that this like guild of real life people made. One of them's character name was Takemikazuchi. So in this world, all of the warriors and the people believe that one of their gods is of creation is Takemikazuchi. So, you know, kind of an interesting parallel from the game's perspective of what their deity is to the real life perspective of their deity. So, you know, who knows? Maybe we're all in a video game and these people are programmers. I don't know, but that's the main story of Takemikazuchi, and why I think partially why the Namazu story became so popular isn't just because of the natural disasters and things, but I think partly because it had Takemikazuchi in it. So it's almost like having a celebrity in the story makes the story famous, and then because of that association of fame, the catfish was then able to kind of build his own fame, so to speak. And so with that, that is, I think, everything I managed to shove into my brain about this conversation. Now you know who Takemikazuchi is. More importantly for this case, you know how Whiscash came to be, why it's a water ground type, probably also why it doesn't evolve, because it's supposed to kind of be, a powerful deity that's in its final form. So it wouldn't really make sense to evolve it forward into anything else. It also is kind of weird that it evolves from Barboach, because Barboach is a Loach Pokemon, and I guess Loaches like generally live in dark, muddy waters or like swampy waters, which is how it's described that Whiscash lives is in swamps and the Pokedex and stuff. But obviously, I talked about him being deep underground in the earth and in the mud. So I guess they were just like kind of similar habitats. So like the hell with it, let's make Barboach the initial evolution. Maybe they just did it so they could justify making Whiscash strong. And so it does make sense that maybe they wanted to give it some balance, because typically Pokemon that don't evolve at all are pretty weak compared to the rest of them. And, being a Pokemon that's responsible for tsunamis and earthquakes, interesting parallel with Surf and Earthquake, in that they probably didn't want to make it super weak, but you can only do so much to like justify making this thing, especially the way it looks, making this thing a powerhouse. So I think that was part of the logic behind that, was to just kind of make it the second stage so it could be some kind of potentially usable. I hope you guys had a good time listening to this. I know it was a little bit longer, a lot longer than my other video that I did. As I'm going through, it really depends on how much information these things have packed into them. So if you enjoyed this one, come along. I'm going to be doing more of them. Let me know if you have a favorite Japanese, mythological figure, or if there's a certain Pokemon you've always wanted to know more about. Let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to do an entire video on whatever it is you're interested in. I'm sure I'm going to get to it one day no matter what, but maybe I can get to it a little bit sooner if you let me know that you're interested. Thanks for hanging out, guys. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'll catch you in the next video with some new Pokemon lore. Have a good one.